And I think that these are instances in which not only do we see esports games or players to be one in which we celebrate them for their extreme entertainment or skills, but that we see them as a profession that people should aspire to be. And we think that that is a problem. Because while esports, we believe, is entertaining as a hobby, we think that there is a problem systematically when we let the viewers and let some good players believe that this is one legitimate profession that they can take. Why is this the case? Because we think that mainly there's extreme risk that accrues from the massive type of competition, but we also think that glorification makes it harder for people to delineate what exactly their skills are, simply because esports is considered to be something that is extremely accessible. With that said, what does the glorification look like on the government side? These are probably instances in which we see this profession to have, let's say, high salaries or wages. It also means that they are appearing on mainstream and traditional television shows. It also means that they garner massive sponsorships, where companies now gear towards paying off esports as opposed to, let's say, traditional sports. It also means that there's an idealization, especially from the youth who aspire to be like them. We note that in order for this debate to happen, and so that it's not going to be necessarily shallow, we assume here that there is some form of influence that happens on the real life. So maybe there are, let's say, different types of viewers and audiences who opt into esports, but maybe they don't necessarily see this as a profession. We think that that would exist under both sides anyway. But the moment in which we create a scenario in which we assume that these are legitimate types of instances, we think that's when the problem happens, the lack of ability for people to delineate and understand these differences. The main thing that we're going to do coming from government side is to tell you why we think that it is much preferable for us to have esports as a good hobby and entertainment, as opposed to believing that this is one optimal and legitimate success that an individual could take. First argument, why does this legitimize the esports and consider it to be a good career or profession, and why is it something that is bad? So the first analysis we would like to make here is that compared to other skills, hobbies, or even actual sports, the accumulation of information and the techniques that you would get in esports is not necessarily formulated or not necessarily created as an opportunity. So while we agree that failure can also exist in different types of skills and sports that the individual would like to accrue from a very young age, the problem with esports is that you have niche information, niche types of games and strategies that you have to memorize. This means that the only way in which the individual would have to succeed in this esports is that they would spend a considerably significant amount of time in order for them to memorize such skill set. This also means, therefore, that the individual may not have an ability to properly balance their time. This is also more problematic and important for us to note, because especially when so many people, especially youth, can tell their parents or tell their family members, or even like not youth, but individuals who believe that this is a legitimate sport because they're kind of good at it, it means that the moment they fail, the application of these skills cannot be done in real life as well. For instance, being able to memorize all the different techniques of LOL is not necessarily going to help you with hand-eye coordination in different sports as well. So even if you would fail as a basketball player in middle school, at least this allows you to understand how kinetics works. This also gives you some background to go to university and, let's say, take physical education as a traditional option as your major, or you can probably be a coach. A lot of these options are optimal and legitimate when it comes to these different skills, but when you memorize different techniques for esports, that's not necessarily going to be the same thing when you reach in the later years of your life. But the second thing that we would note here, the reason why the chances of failure is much higher and people don't understand that is because, first and foremost, besides the fact that the amount of time is supposed to be significantly higher, a lot of people believe that just because they're kind of good at that sports based on the tier that they are able to access on these esports games, make the illusion that they're probably going to be the same as Faker, or they can probably aspire to be in some, let's say, national team. The problem with this is that individuals more often than not are narrow-minded and skewed towards their own perception of these games. And this is much harder to note because they're given more exposure to the fact that there are success chances as opposed to understand there are significantly higher outliers. The reason why this is different from other types of sports is that when we see an extremely good player such as Kobe Bryant or LeBron James, we already know that they're significantly better than us, as opposed to an individual who can immediately reach, let's say, gold or diamond level here as just a normal individual. The ability for them to believe that they may probably have a less chance of success is removed, as opposed to a very, very inhumane or very, very inhumanely talented athletic player in sports. And that's why we think it's much harder for this player to understand and conceptualize the reality for them, because of the fact that esports is considered to be extremely accessible. Note here that this is also significantly worsened by the fact, there's an increase of competition as well. Because of the fact that it's accessible, more and more people opt in. So the conclusion of this first argument is to let you know that while it may be fun and while there may be unique skill sets that you may earn by playing esports, it is not considerable for an individual who has a higher chance of failure because that skills may not be transferable in other places as well. Before I move on, POI from, All right, second argument. Why is it harmful and how does this affect like viable policies as well? Because we would note here that we would prefer a world, no thank you, in which governments would ensure that there are certain interventions or policies that will ensure that individuals are more responsible. This is significantly important when we're looking at online spaces that are much harder to regulate, as opposed to things like traditional sports where you have independent bodies and committees in which they can access and allow individuals to assess certain harms. Esports have dynamics that are extremely unstable. Things, let's say abuses of programs, or things like hackings, or things like it would be heavily dependent on the stream or the platform of these different countries are in place. So what this means is that local governments have a more difficult time framing policies such as shutdown laws that would productively influence young people to ensure that they don't play past, let's say, 12 or midnight. These are such policies that are likely to be retracted in a world in which people believe that continuously playing and trapping themselves in a room is something that will give them a viable opportunity in the future. But the way in which we would compare with this in their second analysis is to let you know that a lot of other athletic sports, maybe it also has a higher chance of failure as well. At the very least, besides the fact that you can have accumulated skills, the difference is that they're more stable for the fact that there's a target market that is more diverse. It means that you have a loyal fan base that even if they don't know the sports or even if they may not be good as basketball players, you have, let's say, audiences that are based on, let's say, regional understandings or loyalty of that team. As opposed to esports, more often than not, the market is highly controlled and based on, let's say, mainstream audiences who are young and swing audiences who based on the entertainment or the value and trend of that esports. So what happens then is that Overwatch is likely going to be a failure. So a lot of people who invested most of their time on Overwatch is likely to fail and lose that job. The same thing might happen for LoL in the next years as well, when gaming companies now create more new games that would destroy and destruct the previous games that have existed. That's why we think that the mere fact that you would base it on swing audiences that are just simply viewing it for entertainment makes it highly susceptible for these types of careers to also be in threat. We are very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the speech, and I'd like to cross the floor and hear from the first speaker of the opposition, please.
Am I audible?
Yeah, could you move slightly closer to the microphone?
I think I'd switch off my camera to facilitate like better internet connectivity, because sometimes my internet is quite shaky. All right. So one more time, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right, great. So my name is Prosper Michael. I'm going to be LO for this round. I shall take POIs in the chat. I'll do my very best to take at least one POI. I'll prioritize closing so I get closing engagements. And finally, I'd appreciate it if the panel could send me timestamps on the chat space. So first minutes, you notify. And like, I'd equally appreciate if my fifth and sixth minutes are equally notified. So that being said, I would like to start in a bit. All right, so I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think that for this debate to be properly assessed, we need to particularly question the context within which this debate happens. We think this debate happens within a context where there's been a high liberalization of nerd culture. There's been a high liberalization of the fact that it is okay for you as a millennial to sit in your room and be on your laptops or on your phone all day, because people think that that is absolutely normal. We think it equally comes off the back of the fact that due to things like COVID, there's been a high movement of activities from like physical points to virtual points. So what that means is that to a large degree, virtual activities or virtual engagement are now permanent in our society and are here to stay. What this means then is that for this debate to be able to properly happen, we need to appreciate that context and engage the debate within that context. The reason why OG misses out on today's debate is because she doesn't provide like true mutual exclusivity between like esports and actual sports. All she says is that, well, the skills you get in esports are not skills that can transfer into real life. We actually don't think that is true. We think skills like being able to predict threats, being able to properly assess events and necessarily know what's going to come next are things you get through like gaming in esports. We think that those things are like not mutually exclusive. We think that the unique skills that you get from each game or each like sporting activity is similar to what you can get from esports, because we think that to a large degree it equally engages your mental faculties and like a minimal amount of your physical faculties. We think that the very ability to be able to imagine or conceptualize a different world outside your own and engage within it is one that we appreciate as a skill that you get in our world. But more importantly, panel, we think that OG largely misses out on the relevance of like why it is okay for people to be able to monetize their leisure. We think that is something that is very, very important in today's debate as a matter of principle. But secondly, on impact, we think that OG still runs away from the fact that esports is not particularly anything radically different from normal sports. They do not engage that as radically as they should. And we think that that in of itself is very, very bad. So what you'll be getting from me in my speech, you'll be getting three things primarily. First of all, I'm going to analyze to you why, like, due to context, we need to engage or like allow for esports to be normalized. Secondly, I'll give you the principle to explain why it is okay for people to be able to monetize their like leisure. But thirdly, I'm going to show you why esports is not particularly different from like normal sports in of itself. And finally, I'm going to provide you a mechanism as to the structure that exists in status quo. So first off, to the structure that exists in status quo. Panel, we think that in status quo, people who engage in esports or professional gaming actually engage within a particular framework where there is a league. There are people who particularly dictate those league sponsorships, and real monetary income is one thing that you can make from these particular spaces. We think what that means then is that it is more or less an approximation to normal sporting activities in society. We think that to that extent, it means that people do not just engage in a space where there are no rules or there are no laws. So what that means is that the argumentation you get from OG about how there's no fairness within this space because people can hack, etc., etc. We think those things are actually non-existent. If you are caught hacking or if you are caught cheating in a gaming, like in a professional gaming activity, you are going to be kicked out of the league. We think these are things that happen in Dota, in things like Modern Warfare. We think these are things that are actually real. So it means that to a large degree, the engagement that goes on there is one that's reasonably governed under a certain rules or a certain set of norms. We think what that then means is that there's a certain level of fairness that binds everybody that engages in that space. It means that as a gaming fraternity or as a structure in of itself, it is one that is legitimate, it's one that is well structured. What's the impact of this argument? It means that to a reasonable extent, people can invest their time and propose, like people can invest their time and expect reasonable returns from that investment. We think that it means that nobody is going to engage or enter into that space, start getting the reasonable returns that they probably like permutated that they will get. Like worst case scenario, you meet a better player and like that's going to like be the end of you. We think that that is equally the same principle under which sporting activities in real life and even every facet of real life operates under, because we think that even reality shows that prioritize like singing competitions equally work under the same principle. Football leagues work under the same principle. But secondly, we think that due to the structure's existence in these spaces, the impact you get again is the fact that it is more accessible. Just like OG says, we think it is more accessible than every other like facet of like of sporting activities. Because for example, all you need is a freaking laptop and a gamepad. You don't need to spend a lot of money and getting like facilities and getting like more than enough. Like you don't need to spend more than enough on getting like coaching, etc., etc. Because we think that the gaming community is one that liberalizes knowledge. What that means is that for me to know the moves to particularly do to for me to know the moves or the codes to particularly engage to like beat a particular stage in that game is one thing that is open to all. It all boils down to like your dexterity in like engaging it. So we think that that means that it is one that gives space for any and everybody to be able to actualize within its particular frameworks. We think that that means that to a reasonable extent, it's one that is like sustainable in that regard. But more importantly, panel, I'm going to take OG before I continue. OG.
Yeah, thank you very much. You talked about how game is such an accessible hobby, but you didn't tell me why it's favorable sports that government has to endorse to people.
I'm going to get to that. But again, panel, we think that we need to engage the principle in today's debate, and the principle is simple. We think OG and the whole government bench needs to particularly defend why it is wrong for people to monetize their leisure or monetize things that their hobbies in of that regard. We think society has come to a point where people can feel free to be able to make money off of things that do not cause any level of harm to any individual. We think to the very extent where there is no harm caused when you engage in gaming activities. It's one thing that's okay. But more importantly, we think that due to the large unavailability of spaces for young individuals to particularly actualize, we think that it's okay for them to be able to make returns or for them to be able to make money off of gaming activities. We think that is reasonable. But more importantly, we think that, and this is very important, so I'll be very clear, we think that the physical exertion that is demanded from normal sporting activity is one that is particularly unfair and makes it difficult for people to engage with it because it operates under three particular principles. First, it operates under a certain level of randomness and lottery of birth. What that means is that I am not going to be able to be as great a basketball player as Kobe Bryant because I'm just 5'8". We think that that kind of level of randomness means that I don't get to actualize within that space. We think that what you get from esports is an equality in that regard because everybody gets to engage with the same level of opportunity within that space. We think that that's okay. But again, panel, we think that why this is okay is because in truth, virtual reality is one thing that's particularly here to stay because now a lot of activities have been moved online and we think that's particularly okay. We think for OG to win today's debate, they need to show why there is no other alternative than to outrightly cut out glorification of these sporting activities and their players. Thank you.
Yep. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Just because you cannot necessarily refute the arguments of the opening government, you can't just claim that we didn't say anything. I'm going to go one by one on how did we necessarily differentiate this esports to other sports and why is it such an unstable market and provides false hope and promises to the youngsters, usually to these people. Firstly, they said that it is a complete equality of the chances. But we told you that, look, like the peak of the career of the esports players are 19 to 23. After the age of 23, it is likely that your skills gonna slow down. What it means is that you have to spend significant amount of time when you are in school, which is middle school and high school. I think it is very important to notice that a lot of people have that false hope. For example, I think Sally told you that if you are, for example, diamond tier of the League of Legends, for example, compared to all of the other classmates who are bronze and silver, you feel like you are going to actually become the esports player. But the problem here is not necessarily that he has a talent or not. Because if we see the institutional help, if there is any objective eyes could tell this guy that you are not a match for a professional esports player or not. For example, let's say if you're a basketball team or you're a potential promising basketball player, you have the school coach, you have the institution that looks at you at an objective eye. But only institution that's going to look at you as an esports player is the profit-motivated private institution that is sponsored by SK and Samsung, who just wants a larger pool of the candidates of the esports player. That means it is likely that you fall into this false hope and spend significant amount of time, which does not necessarily materialize into anything. For example, even if it is a stable sports, I think it is difficult for you to move on to the next, for example, esports. Why? Because first of all, you have to follow the market. Even if you are a StarCraft esports player, it is difficult for you to find a similar game because then the market could refuse. For example, at that time, Overwatch could be the game, for example, because people have to watch the game so that the sponsors can recruit the esports players. Secondly, games destabilizes the market easily. For example, let's look at the case of StarCraft and Overwatch. For example, Overwatch has failed not because of the fairness of the game, is because of some vast majority of the players from China or from Europe in Korea has used a lot of hacking programs so that they could actually ruin the fairness of the game. If the popularity of the game decreases, the whole market of esports competitions just go down. Look at StarCraft. For example, some competitive players has fixed the result of the game and nobody watches that game. All of a sudden, what it means is that in a market where the skills are not transferable, you are losing your job at an instant because it is such a destabilized market. That is why you don't have an objective eye to gauge if you're a good player or not, so that you actually have a false hope. Secondly, it is a destabilized market compared to, for example, ping pong, football, and singing, for example, because it has been there for decades, and there are objective eyes and public who can actually see and gauge the objective skills of this person. That is why their opening oppositions is wrong. And they have never, ever told us, why is it something that we have to favor as a government or endorse as a government? Because we have told you from the beginning of the speech that, that it is not something that we favor. And this is the substantive I'm going to provide to you here. I told you, there is a likelihood of a trade-off for this false hope to be materialized. For example, a student who falls into the sweet talk of the KT and Samsung in Korea, for example, to come into our team and learn more about the League of Legends because they provide the computer, for example. They provide a legitimate reason for the parents to understand they can play games, for example, for hours, significant amount of hours in exchange, as opposed to studying, for example, in the classroom, for example, right? It is a legitimate institution, for example, giving you the hopes and chances. But as in fact, they recruit thousands and thousands of people just for the larger pool of the candidates of their own team. There are profit-motivated organizations. Plus, the more important thing we have to realize here is that game does not necessarily affect people in a good way. Like if you play sports at a young age, for example, it is likely that you're going to be healthy. For example, it is a chance for you to understand the kinetics. It's a chance for you to understand the physics of how human body works and how you keep your health, for example, how your body moves. It is a permanent knowledge that could affect your body and life in a beneficial way. But what it does to the growing children is that it has a probability of giving ADHD to these people. It has a probability of giving impulse control disorder for these people, or it could even at worst, confusion between the reality and the game world. I'm not saying this is the vast majority of the world, because opposition is going to say these are psychopaths, sociopaths, who's going to be like that anyway. But if there are studies suggesting that this could be caused by games, what I'm saying here is that there are millions of other things that government wants to endorse and favor, because we want to encourage them to play sports, for example, the team sports, because it teaches, for example, the team spirit for these people, or any type of like jogging even. I think these are significantly better than any other games out there, because it is destabilized market. It is skills that are not transferable, even if you become a very successful esports gamer. Any POIs? CO, please.
Even if playing video games turns you into fucking Ted Bundy, there are already YouTubers and Twitch streamers that massively glorify this. How is this in any capacity unique to esports players?
You're right. There are significant YouTubers, there's significant streamers. They also suffer because of the destabilized market, right? Because you can't just simply change the game that you stream. You can't just simply change the game you actually play, for example, while other people watch, right? It is also a very destabilized market for YouTubers and streamers. That is why it is completely difficult for them to change subjects, change games at a second. Compared to other people who broadcast, right? It is significantly destabilized market for them too. That is why we as a government want to make a it is also likely to affect the legislations, because Korean government, for example, wants to have has been applying legislations like shutdown law, where students cannot play games after 10 p.m., for example. There has been increasing pressure to the government because of these rising population who wants to enjoy a game. They are likely to actually scrap out this law too. What it means is that it is likely that we cannot necessarily provide a a conducive environment for of education for these people, because they lose significant amount of time because of the significant amount of contribution you have to do in terms of learning how to play this game at a top class. And two, you cannot necessarily study in those times. I think with these reasons, I think studying provides like larger window of opportunity in exploring a lot of jobs, for example, job fields, for example, or any other industries. Compared to that, I think games provide just lesser chance. Proud to propose.
So give me 10 seconds, if that's okay.
No worries. Let me know when you're reconnected and I will turn off my camera so your internet isn't burdened.
One, no, for any government team to win today's debate, they need to ultimately prove how the harms that exist in esports are ones that are mutually exclusive from harms that exist in other sports like chess, other sports like football, basketball, and even university debate competitions, right? And we think that they fail to largely do that to all extents. So let's start from the top. What is the first thing that they say? They talk about false hope and how it gives people the idea that they can eventually rise up and also get the billions of dollars. We think these things also exist in other sports like football. Even in my home, in my backyard, a lot of children play football in the hope that they end up like Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi. Meanwhile, they will end up like him, right? We think those also still exist. Now, they also say that, well, your skills will slow down when you get to 23 and things like that. It means that you can't take advantage of it. Firstly, right, we think that it's not true. One, because the gaming is something that is mental in of itself. The second response, we think that harm in itself exists in other sporting activities like 100-meter races, right? When you're 40 years, you can't run like Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt can't run like how he used to run when he was 20, right? We think that those harms equally exist. But then you also say that you have the probability to get things like ADHD, you can become a sociopath or things like that, right? We think that first of all, that is really not true, right? And then second of all, this harm exists in other sporting activities like boxing, right? So when people get to hit each other in the ring every day, they can equally have that propensity of getting ADHD, or becoming a sociopath or being aggressive and things like that, right? And another thing they say is that, well, the chance that is going to destabilize the market, right? We think that harm is not mutually exclusive, because in the 1990s, when doping in athletics became very, very rampant thing, a lot of people put out investment from the entire athletics industry, which led to a lot of series of bad events for the whole athletic industry, right? So we think that this harms in of itself exists in other sporting activities, right? And they say that, well, sponsors or corporate sponsors can use these gamers to their own selfish advantages. I think these harms equally exist in other sports like football and basketball, where people are promised that they're going to play in big clubs like Barcelona and Chelsea. Meanwhile, they don't end up there and things like that, right? We think that these harms are ones that are not mutually exclusive. So they talk about how in this sports is something that is bad because you need to acquire a lot of information, right? We think this is the same thing for other sporting activities like chess and university debating. As a chess player, you need to learn a lot of strategies like Sicilian defense and things like that. As a university debater, you need to watch a lot of YouTube videos and a lot of current issues. So we think these other sporting activities require you to have lots of information. So they say, well, there's no form of regulation. People can play into the night and things like that, right? Now I'm supposed to be preparing for like my final exams. I am here debating, right? I was watching debate videos through the night to prepare for WUDC. It means that those arguments about how people waste their time on esports and things like that also exist in other forms of sports like football, basketball, chess, and things like that. Because you equally have to learn a lot of strategies, right? So they say, well, it's not safe because a lot of these sporting activities or a lot of these esports can be hard, right? We think this harm also exists in things like athletics because there have been a lot of instances where runners have been seen to have doped and used a lot of drugs that will make them run faster. So if it's about cheating, we think other sporting activities equally have the likelihood of cheating, right? We think that those harms are really not mutually exclusive, and that's why opening governments cannot win today's debate, right? Panel, let's move on to today's debate. Let's move on to the positive matter that I bring to you. We think that esports serve as escape routes for lots of persons, right? It means that the aim of sports in itself is to be accessible so people from all categories and people from all walks of life can be able to access and find a way to monetize their hobbies and to monetize their skills, right? We think that a lot of people in status quo cannot monetize the talents that they have, and we think that this is something that is bad. The same way we encourage people to monetize the idea of singing, the idea of drawing, we think it's the same thing that we do in our world, where we encourage people to monetize their skill of playing games. We think that these people are stuck in their hobbies and can't make lives out of it, right? We think a lot of teenagers are stuck in the idea of playing games and they can't make lives out of it, right? In our world, we monetize it, at least we get a certain level of economic returns. Recognize the comparative that exists in today's debate. We think on government world, people are going to play esports regardless, but they don't monetize it. In our world, they get to play esports and monetize it. So in their world, these guys are rather wasting their time because they don't get any economic benefits from playing sports, right? We think that that's in of itself is a bad comparative that's shown by in today's debate. Yes, I'll take closing governments if they have a point. If not, opening government should.
Yeah.
Okay. With CG here, why do you think at a point in time, like you need to update your gaming rig every year in order to, and like update your game every year as well to be even remotely decent at playing this game? Why do you think it is accessible?
This also exists in other sports like chess, right? So in the chess association, you need to constantly renew your membership and things like that. But you can't buy government case because there's no way you can prove that esports is mutually exclusive from other types of sports, and that's why government doesn't have a case in today's debate. We think that esports has a huge market capitalization and it's a multi-million-dollar industry. That means that opposing its glorification means that people shouldn't invest in this particular space. That means that you harm the state in office of because the state gets a lot of benefits from this particular sport because these guys pay taxes, right? But then secondly, a lot of people make money off esports, right? It means that it has created employment for lots of people, for lots of teenagers and things like that. But then in the world where you say we shouldn't glorify it, it means that you are regretting the idea that people get a certain level of economic returns from the things that they love. But then lastly, on the idea that sports has to be accessible, right? We think that for sports to be accessible, it means that it has to create an environment where persons, regardless of their disposition, like can participate in. So, for example, cancer patients who cannot move around use like esports as their only mechanism to also like entertain themselves or to get a certain level of like economic remuneration, right? We have people who are like physically challenged and things like that and can engage in aggressive or physically like demanding sporting activities. Use esports as their only mechanism to get certain level of like economic remuneration or get a certain level of entertainment. We think that opening opposition wins today's debate because of two things. Firstly, we've been able to show you how esports is not different from other sporting activities because if it is time, university debating equally consumes time. You need to spend a lot of time watching YouTube videos. This is about aggression. We think boxing, ice skating, bull riding, they are equally aggressive, right? If it's about destabilization, I've shown you how like doping in the athletic industry in of itself has led to destabilization in the past. We've also shown you how like sports in itself should be accessible. We think that people who can engage in physically demanding sports use this as their only means of entertaining themselves and getting levels of economic remuneration. Proudly open opposition.
I'd like to thank the speaker
I think the problem in opening half is that they are stuck into very widely different conceptions of what esports is. I think to that extent, OG thinks that it should always be a hobby, and O thinks that it should always be a sport. Neither team tells you as to why it should be a hobby or why it should be a sport. Because notice that in reality, it's probably in between, just like in any other sport, which is to say, I might play football as a hobby, but like say Ronaldo plays it as a profession. Similarly, like someone might play or might watch 10 days videos or ninjas videos and like esports, but at the same time play casually. But at the same time, someone can also be like 10 day who plays it on a very serious level. We think at that point in time, when the reality is that it's somewhere in between, why do we still think that esports is something, esports and professionals playing esports should not be glorified, right? Firstly, we think like in general, notice that how esports thrives, right? And OG does not provide you any characterization about how like the market economics of esports work. We think like they tell you that, oh, you need to keep recruiting more new members to play the game, but that is just one of it, because most Call of Duty and all of these other games, major esport games, are largely free of cost in terms of access, right? Which is to say you can download it and start playing. But notice that at any point in time, there are multiple microtransactions which people fall into a vicious trap of opting into. Notice that at a point in time, tomorrow Ninja goes ahead and like plays in a certain gun skin which cost him $1,000. Notice that that becomes the aspiration, although that gun skin probably has nothing to do with like going ahead and amplifying the skill level of you as a player or making you better at that sport. Something which exists in other sports, wherein like if you buy a good Babolat racket, we think like it helps you plays your shots better. It's probably lighter. It's probably more aerodynamic than what you're using in right now, right? We think at that point in time, this intangibly, this is just blatant false marketing and just lying to people with regards to like what a particular thing can do and setting false aspiration standards, not because like it is unattainable, but because of the fact that it is something which has no tangible impact in how well you do in that particular sport. But notice that unlike conventional sports, there are also multiple things that are wrong with esports and like professionals playing it in general, right? Firstly, notice how the cost of entry is something that exists, right? And we'll do it in two manners, right? Firstly, we'll deal with players who probably can go ahead. We'll deal with players and then we'll go ahead and deal with casual players, right? Which is to say more interested and more invested sports player who can probably do well even in esports and has the potential of doing well. And the other casual gamer like myself, right? What are the two differences and why we think in both worlds is something incredibly bad? Now, for a serious player who probably has a future in that particular esport, right? Notice that unlike physical sports, you don't have an innate capacity to go ahead and do well. And we think innate capacity, unlike what O tells you, is something which is good, which is to say that in a favela in Rio with minimal resources, you can still become a Ronaldinho, you can still become a Neymar, right? The reason being is that at a point in time, you have certain skills of like moving about, being very nimble with your feet or having a low center of gravity. And at the same time, you can go ahead and simply play with a normal ball on the streets in order to make yourself better every day. We think at that point in time, that the access is something which is much more. Because notice that in order to be better at esports, you need to first invest in a very expensive gaming rig. And that gaming rig, because of the nature of tech itself, is something which updates every 6 months. So today you have the NVIDIA GeForce XYZ. Tomorrow you have NVIDIA GeForce XYZ version 2. And at a point, and games keep giving out DLCs and expansion packs, which are also things that you need to keep buying, the new gun skins, new character models, etc., etc. We think in both worlds, what essentially happens is that in order for you to actually get better at it, this is a vicious cycle of investment that you need to keep entering into. Now this co-ops into like then OG's larger mechanism of why then it becomes also like, given the amount of success is also limited, which we also think is also there in normal conventional sports. But notice that given the fact that you need to continuously keep spending in it is something that they don't take care of, right? Because notice that O can't simply come up and tell you that, oh, chess, and this is where like I think casual players is something we need to consider as well. Because O can't simply come up and tell you that chess membership fee you pay every year and therefore like that is also expensive and you need to keep spending money in it, right? Because notice that at any point in time, the idea of happiness correlated to aspiration is something which is different in when you're playing a conventional sport as opposed to an e-sport. What do I mean by this? Notice that when I'm playing a conventional sport, going ahead and like basically playing with my friends and winning at my local community level is still something that gives me happiness, and is something that any kid can probably do. Probably be a part of their school sports team, class sports team, and like play with against their friends and win, and that gives them some happiness. And a lot of players are okay with that, right? I play football every Saturday and I win against my local club, and that's happiness for me, right? Unlike esports, wherein like to play Dota, you have to literally spend around 500 to 600 hours grinding yourself to death in order to go ahead and even be remotely well to learn the game, to be decent enough or even average enough to enjoy it, right? Therefore, at that point in time, we think the idea of aspiration is extremely different and is extremely different across both spheres. And we think we break that deadlock which exists in opening half, because notice that in opening half physical sports, your idea of happiness is like in opening half, Ninja sells Fortnite upgrades versus Ronaldo selling more boots is something which will continue to exist, and that's a wash, but we probably break it. But before that, go ahead. Okay, saying no, POI. Notice that
So
OG,
we think that
in general,
you
it's
can
protected. It's protected. As a young person, like notice that also this notion that there's a lot of toxicity, and this toxicity is imbibed by these professionals themselves, right? Which is to say, given the fact that these professionals' entire existence is in the virtual space, which is to say they are likely prevalent in Reddit, they're likely prevalent on YouTube or Twitch or Discord. We think at that point in time, there's extremely limited accountability, because in esports, in like the internet space in general, because no one regulates it, right? At that point in time, we think there's a lot of toxicity that is going around, and there's good players, like say for example Carrie Minati, who is the greatest player of PUBG in India, is someone who abuses girls and like lower caste people every day in his streams, right? We think at that point in time, given the fact that as a young person, and OJ tells you that young person probably now can't spend enough time in studying, but notice that even if like let's say that is also true for conventional sports, wherein if you like, since chances are limited, you also probably like in football also like chances are also limited, but notice that there's a unique harm in itself in esports, wherein you get toxicity so much that you're mentally very, very depressed at that point in time and traumatized. For all those reasons, extremely proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker.
Doing. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Fuck.
All right. Assuming we're audible, right? Okay, starting in a second. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. What I think the government bench lacks is uniqueness. It lacks uniqueness, firstly, because opening government claims that this profession has a high amount of risk and competitiveness. Well, welcome to the world. Each profession is a risk that you have to take. And we don't think the world that we are living in, that is globalized and is full freelancers, is any different in terms of risk and competitiveness. Secondly, opening government wishes to claim that you get no intrinsic skills from this hobby and this endeavor. Thus, this is a unique harm. We deny that premise. We think that at the point in which you spend time on something, when you give all that you can give in terms of concentration, attention, making plans, staying committed and consistent, this is something that you get out of this, even if you fail. And thirdly, we think that closing government is not unique when they claim that somehow this glorification will lead you to get baited and to buy microtransactions and equipment. Notice this is not unique to the motion, because you get baited by the games themselves that give you lucrative advertisements, as well as other revenues on social media such as Twitch and YouTube and other people that are sponsored for this. Now, what is unique in this debate? I think aside from ignoring YouTube and Twitch, what is unique in this debate and in this motion is firstly that the glorification of those people gives the capacity for women gamers to break stereotypes and express the problems, the structural problems that exist within the gamer communities. But secondly, it removes the guilt and it removes the bad feelings from enjoying that hobby, even if you're not pursuing a professional careers. And those are the two constructive points that I will make in my speech today. Firstly, why do we have less sexism and why women gamers are better on our side? We think that in the status quo, since this is an emerging industry that has no time for prejudice and is based on only your performance, only your skills, we have a tendency of having women gamers represented in those esports. And we think even if they're not a majority at the moment, at least they're present in each team. And this is an increasing tendency that is likely to get higher in the future. And we think this is capable of fixing a few structural problems. The structural problems I'm talking about are firstly, massive amount of stereotypes that women don't belong in the men-dominated gamer communities, that they're just not meant to be, not by their own efforts, but by some intrinsic differences in the way that they're built. They're not meant to exist there. But also, the second structural problem is that often enough they're met with sexism, creepy messages, discrimination, and other kinds of oppression. Those are unique problems that women in the gaming community are experiencing when they're not regarded as individuals that just have some fun hobby or are as capable as male gamers, but they are seen as somebody that does not belong. Why are we capable of addressing that? I think the first mechanism is pretty intuitive. We're showing to the world that those women gamers that are in the professional play, that are glorified, that are seen as capable and as role models, they break the stereotypes because they show that they're meant to be in this domain, that they're worthy of being in this domain, which breaks the logic that women just don't have to belong there. But secondly, it breaks stereotypes because it gives those women, since they're glorified and they have platforms and they're seen as people who are capable not only in playing but in speaking, that giving them a platform to speak about the structural problems that are happening within the community, and not only to speak about the structural problems, but to also shame the people who have wronged them and to also reassure their fellow women gamers about what they're going through. We think this is unique compared to any other platform such as YouTube and Twitch, because in those platforms, gamer girls are said to be successful because of other arbitrary reasons. For example, Pokimane is seen as successful because she's beautiful and she clickbaits people, but not because of her skills. In esports and in glorification, this is a unique mechanism that serves to help women. And it helps those women because it firstly gives them hope that they are not alone, that they belong in there, and reassures them. But secondly, it reassures any professional women gamer because it removes the imposter syndrome that they don't belong in this community. This serves to massively help the many women that are playing in sports today, even if they don't wish to go into a professional endeavors. But secondly, I want to talk about legitimacy in gaming. We think in the status quo, there is a problem in which it is seen as a profession that is just a waste of time, that is just fiction, and you're not doing anything with yourself. We think we're uniquely capable of fixing that at the point in which, firstly, we're showing that this is a legitimate tool for earning money and having a profession. Secondly, that this is a legitimate tool through which you can gain valuable skills and recognition from the mainstream. And thirdly, this is a legitimate tool because it offers vulnerable people within our society that are gated from other hobbies and professions due to certain disabilities or incapacity to function in social situations, to have a valuable profession and to feel good about themselves. We think this is uniquely capable of offering those people the removal of any guilt that they feel, that they are rejected from the mainstream and what they're doing is not worth enough. Before I continue, I will take a point from opening.
So the glorification in this motion that you have to specifically defend or go against is that it is driven by a community of young boys who idolize male players, especially with these unregulated communities and spaces of the online world. How then is this woman player going to have this access point of this type of empowerment that you so want to achieve under your side?
Nowhere in the motion he said that we have to defend the male-oriented gaming community and the esports community. We think it is fair to presume that we can glorify women players that are equal in skill, and that's it. Now, why is this unique? We think glorifying esports player is unique because it is paving a narrative aside from YouTube and Twitch that validate themselves within their own communities, because it breaks into the mainstream. It breaks into the mainstream in terms of investment from views, coverage from the news. It breaks into the rest of society, and this is how it validates people. And we think this is uniquely important in validating people, because many people are not pursuing professional sports, yet they're professional careers, yet they're gaming because it is just something fun to do. They do it because they find a meaning to themselves. They find a meaning in it. They use it as a tool for escaping reality. And many people, as I have already mentioned, have certain disabilities and certain barriers that prevent them from doing other social activities, find especially huge amounts of meaning within it. So at the point in which this is legitimized and this is validated by the mainstream society, not only within the communities that they coexist with, we remove the guilt and the negative feelings that they associate and that they experience every single moment that they're playing games, and we allow them to actually have fun while playing those games. This is hugely important, not only for the average gamer, but also for vulnerable people that I've already talked about, which use those games as a way of not only feeling good, but chasing professions where they nowhere else can. For all those reasons, very proud to oppose.
One, let's rebut CO, right? Streamers and YouTubers, they popularize content, and basically content which is attached to the game and not really the game that you're playing, which means at all points in time, gameplay commentaries, maybe even gameplay tutorials, hacks or cheats, etc., or maybe even just the value of that player who's on that Twitch streaming website or even on YouTube is what values more than the game playing itself. Therefore, the idea of YouTubers and streamers going ahead and basically popularizing the game may not be as valuable, because it's the person who is basically popularizing it who's becoming popular. For example, PewDiePie is basically commentating on that game which he is playing. Therefore, PewDiePie becomes famous and the content he generates is PewDiePie oriented, and therefore the game is not which is being promoted, right? On the other hand, esport players, when glorified, have certain impacts which are basically ranging anywhere from having this very false sense of success and also no availability of hierarchy in the sports, which can actually provide them lucrative alternative. At that point of time, they have to, these aspirations that are created are basically very different from that created by the YouTubers. But also understand on the second side of risk and competitiveness. Understand, we think that the risks to return ratio in esports is substantially lesser than that in other sports, because therefore the expectations that are created are that you are going to have a lucrative amount of return after you win a certain tournament, for example, $1 million, right? At that point of time, you start to play it. But what you don't realize that there are no hierarchies in it. For example, if you play football, if you play good in a region, you get selected in that regional team or a local team. You get paid accordingly. You maybe get selected in a state team, university team, or probably even a national team, and then play international foil, Olympics probably, or even a World Cup. But at a point in time, you don't do that. You don't have that in esports. That hierarchy doesn't exist. You don't have more opportunities of income from these aspects of hierarchy. This means your ability to get any kind of lucrative gain is reduced to the niche of that sport. Therefore, until unless you are the absolute best, which means you have not given up a substantial number of hours, investment, money on the amount of hardware and software that you had to buy, till that time, you will not have the access to being a proper esport player, especially one who has lucrative gains on his side. But also on the idea of sexism and misogyny, extremely important. Understand two things. One, that the entire idea of esports is dependent on an industry which runs on the internet, which promotes anonymity and is mostly oriented for men. For example, most men have more access to women, even in the US where access is way more, which means the entire content that is generated on the internet, especially oriented to game, is mostly masculine in nature and basically attempts to cater to men. For example, sexualizing female characters. At all points in time, the very goal of these creators, of game creators, are basically to woo these male players all over the world, casual or professional. At that point of time, when this entire industry is basically sexist and misogynist, to expect that women can go ahead and even excel in it, and even when they excel, they will be appreciated for the same, is extremely low. Therefore, the possibilities are also low. See any major gaming league tournament, and you'll not find enough women to even think that they can have a separate league for women themselves. For example, you have WNBA for that matter, and women's sports, for example, women's hockey, and women's basketball, and women's football as well. At that point of time, access is something which is extremely downplayed in that case for CO as well. Understand, the anonymity is further promoted by this toxicity which these players are basically promoting for more players to come and play. This anonymity basically makes sure that you're not found out, and therefore you are more bound to be more sexist, you're bound to be more toxic on the internet, and therefore never be found out. And since it's an absolutely unregulated space which finds very difficult to have any kind of regulation from the government, because everyone escapes, at that point of time women are harmed forever, trauma is all over the place, even children get harmed, and they substantially have to face online bullying, which is more or less promoted by this very hierarchy, right, of these individuals. Therefore, at all points in time, we don't think that this promotion happens. Also understand, say if CEO wants to talk about games like Animal Crossing, where there are popular female players, notice it's because the game is considered non-masculine, as they don't have aspects of violence, right? This is also true in conventional sports and sports like gymnastics and volleyball, where women players are more popular. But the structural problem of inequality in sports will still exist even in all cases. Therefore, at all points in time, you cannot escape the idea of misogyny just by saying that we'll have female players. But we tell you there won't be any, right? But also understand few responses to OO as well, because the difference between esports and normal sports was one of their more important contingencies. Understand, foundational skills are those where you have played substantially in your life, you have certain muscle growth, you have that skill engraved in your mind because that's your muscle memory, right? At that point of time, when you have that practice, you have time invested and you have inherent skills, and you don't need a laptop or a gaming rig for it. What happens is that you're naturally okay with playing sports. You have to start from the scratch when it comes to esports, right? And therefore substantial investment comes, and that's where the problem of access comes, right? Because you have to buy hardware, technology changes every once in a while, every year a new gaming rig comes in, you have to buy that one, every year a new skin will come in, a new version of that game would come in, and therefore that excess amount of microtransactions that are promoted not just by these players who are glorified, but also by this entire industry which is basically rigged to make you spend more and more every single day, is basically dependent on these players basically promoting those skins, because these players are using those skins which have no tangible benefits for you, but just because it looks good, and therefore this promotion by itself makes you buy those, and therefore benefits these industries, these corporations that basically make those games. Before that, quickly OO.
We think that they equally get certain skills like teamwork and team effort in our world. Engage. Secondly, if your problem is sexism, why don't you advocate for better like female representation?
At a point in time, you talk about skill, we don't understand that even if you get skills like teamwork and cohesion inside this space, why at any point in time these skills will be something which will be inclusive of all communities that have or don't have money. For example, favela people or people from India who can't really access laptops in the first place or even internet, right? This means that this is a completely upper class exclusive zone where certain people who can buy and keep on buying these hardwares can only access it, and therefore only exclusive benefit to these individuals is something which is primarily problematic, because then esports as a lucrative sporting event by itself is just for few people. But also understand, monetizing hobby, it's also a lie, because yeah, you cannot, not everyone can do it, and therefore it's extremely expensive. But lastly, on the idea of this entire barrier to entry, right? Because at all points in time, when you don't have these accesses, right, you don't have this ability to access these hardwares, what you end up doing is that you constantly play it. You have basically sacrificed those hours that were supposed to be for your studies or probably your professional career, but you ultimately realize that you cannot keep on investing on it, and therefore all this time that you invested on these sports was basically wasted. Ultimately, what you understand is this is a vicious cycle of creation of false demands through these players who are basically glorified for the reason of making people buy these products which have no use at all for that human who is basically going to play. These individuals only lose lose in this process. It is a very small industry, doesn't benefit anyone.
Pano, my girlfriend is obsessed with League of Legends and not Animal Crossing, so thank you for that sexism, CG. But the important thing is she does not want to become a professional gamer, but she still deserves to not be treated like shit by men. She still deserves to not be taught as lesser and to have role models within the gaming community that say women can be just as good. What am I going to do? Firstly, rebuttals on us, compare with OO, then deal with like GovBench, because they're basically around the same arguments. CG just extended it saying gaming rig, right? Firstly, on the rebuttals to us, they say one, esports is a male-dominated industry and it is broadly a toxic industry. Firstly, this is absolutely untrue. We do to an extent concede that yes, the majority of people who are professional esports players are men, but that still doesn't mean that there isn't like a pretty large amount of women who are involved in this, right? There are like, insofar as a couple of things. One, there have been increasingly more light shed on the sexist processes, which have led to a large amount of them being removed. Secondly, even if we said that this isn't the case, often, how do you call it? Often esports weighs only ability and is able to very objectively remove things like bias, because you can calculate how good someone is by their score, by their KD ratio, by their win rate and things like this. But thirdly, even if this isn't true, women are good enough to make it as esports player, and there are plenty of women who do make it. So we do say that a big percentage of them will still be women. Those women can kick off our impact. We don't need many of them. We need some of them to speak about this. We need some of them to exist as tangible role models. Secondly, they say, but the industry is shit. Well, girls should not participate in it. Maybe, but girls do participate in it, right? Women like gaming for many different reasons across many different people. Most don't want to become professional gamers, but still they want to have some degree of role model to like justify them, especially at the point where people tell them that this isn't something for them, that this is not appropriate. You need to see someone who is very good, who looks like you and who is the same gender as you in order to feel good. The next thing this comes from CG is they say, but people will always be toxic. You cannot help this in any capacity. This is factually incorrect, because the reason people are toxic isn't because they just like to troll, especially specifically towards women. It is because of ingrained beliefs that these women are in some capacity inferior, or ingrained beliefs that it is appropriate for them to send them creepy messages. We solve both of those things. We give role models that say women are not inferior, they are good enough. But secondly, we give like platform to people who say, please don't send creepy messages to women. It's super creepy. It's not socially acceptable, right? Both of those things, for the reasons for toxicity, we can remove. Okay, then on comparing with OO. OO run two things. One, that there is a principle on you need to be able to monetize your leisure. The reason why this principle simply doesn't work is because you can still monetize your leisure. Esports players still exist. The motion is whether we glorify them or whether we don't glorify them. They at no point explained why this is in some capacity unique, why you need glorification in order to make money from being an esports player. Second thing they say is, but this is like other sports, so we should glorify the players. The problem with this is an incorrect comparative, as pointed out by my first speaker. There are many differences between esports and other sports. The correct comparative is between esports and other places in which we glorify gaming. YouTubers, Twitch streamers. This is where we talk about the tangible differences, about how women on Twitch are massively objectified and are said, they're successful only because they're attractive, but women in esports don't, because they succeed literally only because they are good. These are the major differences we point out. But finally, even if this principle does exist, why does our thing outweigh it? Because it might be good for you to be able to monetize your hobby, but notice, for you to be able to play games like you want is a principle that impacts far more people, right? Far more people should have the right to do what they like than to potentially 1% of people to be able to monetize. Then on broad GovBench, what GovBench say is three things. Firstly, people will want to become like them. Secondly, people will spend money on them. And thirdly, like this is a broadly inaccessible hobby, which comes from CG. Firstly, on people will want to be like them. One, as pointed out, this is symmetrical. People like YouTubers, Twitch streamers constantly glorify this. Here CG say, but the focus isn't on the game itself, the focus is on the YouTuber. This is often factually incorrect when many YouTubers specialize within a specific game and they play only this specific game. Them developing your desire to play this game a lot or to become like them playing this game a lot can absolutely still exist. I don't understand why there's no focus on the game. Secondly, there are outside factors which stop you. Like, I think there is only so much time you can spend playing games before your mom comes in and tells you that there should be something better to do, right? I think there are always external factors which do this. Thirdly, people are broadly rational. People are able to comprehend that this is a very low risk, high reward, that this is a very high risk, high reward thing. Most people don't do this. If it were true, people would constantly move to Hollywood to become fucking reality stars, right? But people are able to weigh this risk and understand that there are better things they need to do. Fourthly, most people don't try to be professional gamers. They just get in because they like the game. This is where we beat the CG claim about, they want to spend so much money on a gaming rig, or the OG claim about they want to spend so much time. Most people have no interest in this. They do it casually, right? Like the majority of people don't ever want to be esports players. They do gaming, but we impact those people by validating them and by telling them, yes, you learn skills from this, and by telling them, yes, this is not a useless hobby, right? These are the people we impact, and these are the majority of people that GovBench never engages with. OG, quick.
Response to the crux of the debate. What about the false hope that is created by the profit-motivated system and the deprived educational opportunity of the children?
I mean, personally, I think at best this is symmetrical for a couple of reasons. One, there are many other industries who generate false hope. Secondly, YouTubers and Twitch streamers constantly generate false hope. They literally tell you, you can also do this. You can also be like us. Many of them literally make courses on how to be a YouTuber, or in order to make you spend money and spend time to give it to them. There are many external factors which do this, but also, thirdly, people are, again, they're not stupid. They get this. They get that they probably won't become Twitch streamers, right? Because notice, this is the other point. It is readily apparent when you are exceptionally good. These Twitch streamers play on these esports players play on a different level. Literally, even visually, the way they play looks different from the way you play. You know that you cannot be one of them, and you know that even if you would want to be one of them, you would have to sacrifice an immense amount of time into these kinds of things. Then CG say, but this is inaccessible. One, of course it is. Notice gaming has become increasingly more accessible to everyone. You can play it on like a shitty Mac, or in general you can play it on GeForce Now and things like this that don't require a good gaming rig. But secondly, Air Jordans are also inaccessible, and they also don't make you better at the game. Air Jordans don't make you jump higher, Pano. But the final thing that CG says is, but these people are toxic, they're shit. One, they're less and less toxic at the point where there's more attention on them, and they have less capacity to mess up in these kinds of ways. But secondly, this is symmetrical. There are many other people we glorify that are shit. Half of sports players are wife beaters, Pano. Literally, this makes no difference. Vote us.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the speech.